You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for premium wine and spirits at vintmarketplace.com. And this episode is presented by Coravin. Coravin is the world leader in at-home wine preservation, allowing you to pour a glass of your favorite wine and enjoy more bottles in your cellar without having to pop the cork. As always, I'm joined by Billy Galanko, who is coming to us from sunny San Diego and is ready with the news of the week.
Thanks for the Ron Burgundy intro. Sunny San Diego. He'll read anything that's on the screen. Los Angeles, San Diego. I'm doing great this week. And there was so much excitement around the MW and other things going on last week that we blew right by the news.
Yeah.
So we're going to give the people what they want. We'll give a two-parter. So this first one is going to be from our newsletter that was on the Vint Marketplace 2 weeks ago. And it is that Dom Perignon is not producing a 2023 vintage. Wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's kind of weird to hear that given the massive case quantity that they usually produce. I didn't look at that article yet. What's the actual reason that they cite? Because to me, if it's a quality kind of thing, like you can't make any.
See, this is why I framed it that way rather than just giving you the background and then seeing what you thought. That was actually my thought exactly. Maybe instead of a few million bottles, you only produce 100,000. But apparently it was just due to weather situations. There was humidity at some points, there was heat, there was mildew. It was just like a perfect storm. And it is going to be their fourth vintage, according to the article, that they have not produced since 2000. So the other ones were 2001, 2011, 14, and now 2023. So
yeah, it's interesting. Do we know what the price impact was, for instance, 2010s and 2012s on the backside of not producing 2011? Or I guess, we don't have 2015 yet, but of the 2012s?
We do. We have, the 2015 is available on the marketplace.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Everybody should go check it out. But
that's current release though.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That is current release, which is also interesting. I'm looking into this and being like, make sure you're like a wary consumer, because it's like market conditions. I'm thinking they're looking at how much inventory is on the market conditions. I think champagne sales slowed a little bit overall last year, and things are like softening a little bit in some of the champagne, like in terms of volume champagne, not really on like the super high end. So what I'm thinking is they're making a business decision and being like, all right, the wine wasn't that great. Is it worth us paying for all the fruit, doing all the process, when maybe we can just sell down some of the vintages that we have? I think it's probably a little bit of both. But again, it is a tête de cuvée. It is a high quality wine. They just do produce so much of it that I was surprised they weren't going to do like any, but that's what they do.
Yeah. And do they assume that would give them the opportunity to bump the price on the next release? I would assume. But
yeah,
it's hard to understand why they would skip out on it if they're not looking to put pressure on pricing at all. But
yeah.
Understand something about it.
They might be adjusting. They were saying the article noted like at a retail price of say $295 for current release. If they don't produce 1 million bottles, it's $295 million of revenue they're not getting. But it could be that they want to adjust prices. I think the prices, to your point though, is it's potentially due to the amount of volume of bottles that are on the market right now. So I think it will be the self-realizing type situation where those bottles sell down, they'll be able to release at the same price or maybe slightly higher come the next one. And then, but you have to remember what Matthew Bicart said when he came on the podcast too, CEO of Bicart. He was talking about how, it used to always be, after 10 years, that's when you release your vintage champagne. And at that time, for some, it was even too young. Now, like the 2015 came out earlier this year. So that was only like 8.5 years of aging before it even came out. So this process is also accelerating. So it might be that they're trying to get other things out, maybe making a different, style that's meant to be released earlier rather than something. So it might be, that might be what they're doing with some of the, like, their thinking and maybe adjusting their style.
Mm-hmm.
But who knows? Yeah. Keep an eye on, keep watching this space. And then the next one is more near and dear to my heart because I just like Central and Eastern European wines. There were, I don't know if you follow the weather in Europe at all, But there's Storm Boris basically caused flooding throughout Poland, not Czechoslovakia. Wow, what am I in 1980? Czechia, as well as Austria and some other regions. And the main region that the article focused on was Niederösterreich, is how you say it in Austrian, is Lower Austria, but basically down where the Kamptal, Wagram, basically these are well known for Gruner and a bunch of other wines. It really was heavily hit by rain and flooding. Now, the flooding, except for the lowest tier vineyards, I guess you would say, and they're literally elevation-wise lowest, would be on the flatter plains. They weren't really affected by the flooding. But what I thought was interesting is basically picture a huge storm dumping like basically half a year's amount of rain or something like that halfway through harvest. Because apparently they had some of the grapes in, then this came, and then you have grapes hanging still. So that was the interesting thing to me is what do you do? Do you try to wait a long time for the grapes? Because for those who don't know, if the grapes on the vine, when it rains a lot, they start to swell, and that dilutes the concentration of flavor. It just messes with the overall balance within the grape. So you can wait, and eventually over time, the berries will go back down in size. But if you wait after a rain, there might be mildew, there might be humidity, things that you don't want necessarily to make a dry wine. So I thought that was really interesting, and I'm interested to see what wines come out of this, because it depends how much fruit you got in before and after.
Yeah, I mean, the decisions, especially when you have a sort of crazy climatic event like that, of when to pick and which blocks, if you have vines at different elevations, like which blocks to use and which wines in a given year, depending on the climate, those are really the biggest decisions that the producer makes. So from a consumer's perspective, I feel like it's hard to look at the region on any given year and make those decisions yourself. You have to rely on the consistent producers to make consistently good wine when things like that happen.
Yeah. I really I bring it up just so people think more deeply about like how specifically these events especially around harvest time, impact what the grapes may look like. So if somebody had got all their fruit in before, you might not notice a difference. If somebody harvests like right after because they're worried about disease pressure, then that wine may be a little bit more lean, less concentrated in terms of like fruit and aromatics. And if somebody waits a really long time, maybe the water will go away and maybe the aromatics and the phenolic ripeness will reach peak intensity, and it'll be an amazing wine. So it's just interesting how these could trickle down.
Yeah, and like I said, if you're a consumer and you see like, oh, I'm trying to decide what vintage to purchase, and you start reading vintage notes and stuff, like for me, from the outside, it's pretty hard, like I said, to make those decisions. You have to choose producers that you know are quality and who are going to make the best decisions year by year, either make wine or not make wine, but know that they're not going to release something that they can't stand by. The best producers don't. And sometimes you can get value there, but I think it's hard to make decisions like year by year.
Well, what I also think is, at least before I got into wine, and I have a lot of friends who think this way too, is if a wine is a single variety wine, like say it's a Gruner from Kamptal or the Wagram or something, everybody's, those grapes it's one grape, so it's all made and picked at the same time. But the winemakers, for the most part, are, depending on the size of the winery, obviously, but are harvesting grapes from either different blocks, different rows, different vineyards, fermenting them separately and then blending at the end, even if it looks like it's a single variety, which it still is from the same place. So I think that's also going to be interesting, because some of the best producers will be able to work their magic with some of the wine that they made earlier, some they made in the middle, and actually blend a cuvee and make a stellar Gruner. So I think that's also something to think about as well. It's like they have these paints on their palate, and it's basically going to be when they harvest, and this is where the winemaking actually comes in a little bit. So cool.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, good things to consider. As thought about, if for people to say things like, oh, like this particular vintage in Napa or somewhere in California, what was cooler or it was warmer? It's always hot in California. Like the variance, I feel like, between, unless you're talking about wines produced at 1,700 feet plus in elevation or anything in the valley, it's warm. It's always warm. Like even if it's a little bit cooler every year, I don't know. It's hard to say that when you put them all side by side, you're really noticing that much of a difference in hot or cold during a given vintage in a place like California.
There's certainly less variation compared to other places that may be more coastal or highly. I agree. I think it's still noticeable, but to many folks, it might not necessarily be. And there are things like smoke and in like extreme extreme heat spells or drought that might be much more noticeable than a slightly cooler year that maybe appears more balanced. So,
Which, and I guess I only say that, and I said something like that 3 times now in this conversation, but I guess really just trying to highlight that for consumers, like, maybe shouldn't spend as much time worrying about some of those things as much as what price are you getting the wine at, what producer is it. Those things feel more foundational to like buying decisions versus am I buying 2016 or 17 or based on climate.
Yes, certainly you want to start with the quality producer and work your way down the variables that you're considering. I think vintage is splitting hairs for a lot of folks that are outside the industry. But speaking of splitting hairs and special vintages, let's get to our interview now. I'm pretty excited that we were able to have Don and Petie Kladstrup on this. They're authors. Those names may not mean a lot to people right off the bat, but they wrote the book Wine and War. They wrote Champagne Charlie, and they also wrote another book called just Champagne about making champagne during World War I. But Wine and War was one of the first books that I think my mom actually gave it to me, got me into wine. There was that one, and then The Billionaire's Vinegar was a different book. But Wine and War really stuck with me because it's a bunch of these little vignettes, stories of how people from different parts of France basically survive the war. Number one, it follows people all the way to prison camps, but also how the wines the vineyards were tended, the wineries were tended, how some of the wines were hidden from people trying to steal them. And it was a fascinating book, and it was really cool to talk to them and actually hear firsthand some of the stories. And they actually share follow-on stories that you might have read about in the book, and then they get a deeper level years later that happened. So I thought it was an amazing conversation.
Yeah, and their passion for both the history and for the wines themselves and for the producers who make them, they just exude interest and passion for those things. They both have like really sharp knowledge of history. They play off one another really well. It's not often that we have interviewing two people at the same time. We've done it a few times in the past. But I thought that they played really well off one another. And Don, coming from his reporting background, national news background and things like that, he definitely has a knack for storytelling and for getting to the heart of the stories that he's telling about the wine industry there. Yeah, really awesome conversation. It was great to have them on, and foundational books for sure for any wine lover.
Yeah. I think definitely Wine and War is amazing for anybody who you think is like a history buff in general and you just want to loop in wine. Champagne Charlie is a really interesting book following Charles Heidsieck and his journey to the U.S. as he tries to sell champagne throughout the world. It's more of a whole background on him in general. He had a crazy life. And then Champagne, Winemaking in World War I and Champagne. I personally haven't read that one yet. Really excited to get my hands on it. But I agree, they make a perfect team. It's cool because like they share an email address. It's Don and Petie. They share authorship on the books. It's always both of them. And it was cool to have them. You could literally see their voices come through in the book, and it just melds so well. I told my wife, I was like, these are some goals for ours to be able to be this cohesive of a team. It's awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I think everyone will enjoy the interview. Definitely go out and try and find those books. Before we get to the conversation with Don and Petey, just remember, if you're looking to drink more wine from your cellar without worrying about wasting what you can't consume, one of the Corvin systems will be your best friend. You can visit corvin.com and use code VINT15 for 15% off your purchase of any of their devices. And again, if you're a member of the trade, you can visit trade.corvin.com for exclusive discounts on the range of products for both home and work. And without further ado, here are our guests, Don and Petie Kladstrup.
Hi, Don and Petey. Thanks so much for joining today.
Glad to be here.
Indeed, we are.
I'm very excited to have you guys on. Wine and War was the book that really tipped me over the edge to take my first wine exam. And then I've since read Champagne Charlie, and I still need to read your other champagne book as well. But I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about your background, what led you guys to France, and then into writing these books.
Okay.
I was just going to say, Wine and War, I think, is also the book that has been gifted to me most from my friends who aren't in wine, but found it through the lens of history or some other means and know that I'm into wine. And so they gift it to me. And so it definitely has a wide appeal go back as far as you want, but tell us about how you got into wine, and was it through the lens of history initially? How did that work?
It started actually when we lived in Minneapolis, and we began doing all the things that were popular at the time. We bought ourselves a winemaking kit.
Yeah, this is back in the 1970s. Yeah. Anyway, our basement smelled like grapes, and the fermenting juice rising up and filling the house. That's where it started. But our real takeoff was when we moved to France and discovered a whole new world.
I never would have guessed that was the sort of cultural moment in Minneapolis in the 70s, was to be making wine in your basement. You might have been some of the first winemakers in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area.
True, you can make wine there, but we certainly wouldn't recommend growing grapes. 30 degrees below zero. Ooh.
As they say, wine's to suffer.
Yeah, unless you're making ice wine.
Yeah.
That's right. So when did you move to France initially in the timeline? Tell us about that journey and what led you to do that.
We came here in 1978 for a very simple reason. Don's job brought us here.
Yeah, I've been working in local television in Minneapolis for about 8 years, and then CBS News in New York called, said, we'd like you to join us. So I said, great. We moved to New York City, spent a couple of years there. Then I was transferred to the Los Angeles Bureau, spent about 6 months there when the boss called and said, we want you to go to Hong Kong. And I said, what? We just bought a house. Our kids are in school. We haven't finished unpacking. I'm sorry. This is really a tough deal, and I wish I could accept, but I have to say no. To which point the boss says, okay, how about Paris? I fainted dead away, or almost did, but went home and I told Petey, I said, Petey, I think I just agreed to move to Paris. But that's how it happened.
Petey, what did you think when he said that?
Naturally, I couldn't argue with Paris. It was a shock in a way. But on the other hand, we had already had word about wanting us to go to Hong Kong. So I guess somewhere we'd already started thinking that we weren't long for Los Angeles. And we found that coming to Paris was maybe the easiest move we'd ever made.
Yeah.
It was a tremendously exciting move. And happily, things worked out very well in terms of where we could live, how the kids could go to school, and Don's job.
But we were really just bowled over by everything we saw and experienced. Living in Paris, a little bit like living in a museum almost. You're surrounded by history. Everywhere you look, there seems to be some historic monument. But then there was also the cuisine, and especially the wine. And that really just knocked us over. We couldn't believe what we were experiencing. It was just like heaven.
Yeah. And so you guys were only supposed to be there for maybe a handful of years. And then did you ask to stay on? Or obviously you guys are still there. It's been 40 plus years. So how?
Yeah, we thought we were here for 2 to 3 years. And it became intoxicating, and as well, the way we were drawn into life here. But also, there were some big changes at CBS happening, and Don had a difficult time with some of the, shall we say, one of the higher ups. And when the boss at ABC, a man maybe you remember, Pierre Salinger, heard that Don was not exactly happy at that moment at CBS, he called and said, "Hey, would you like to come over and work for us?"
And so after 7 years at CBS in Paris, I just practically stepped across the road and joined ABC News. Best move I ever made. It just afforded us so many opportunities. I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was revolution in Iran. It also afforded us living for 2 years in South Africa at the time of the Mandela release. I've been going down there covering the story whenever it began heating up, the bad old days of apartheid. But when Mandela, it seemed, was about to be freed, ABC said, we want somebody down there full time. So for 2 years, we moved down there, and it was great. It was great, but we kept our home here.
At the same time, we also discovered a whole nother wine area being in South Africa. It was exciting and a fun adventure as well to visit the vineyards on the Cape and meet the people there who were struggling against a different sort of thing from what people in Wine and War dealt with.
Oh yeah, and a slight French link with Napoleon's one of his favorite wines being Constantia, so a little bit of a connection. You guys, when you moved or kept your home, have you guys always been based in Paris? And then I know a lot of your books, Wine and War is cool because you guys highlight folks from different regions throughout France. And then I know your other books focus on either Charles Heidsieck from Champagne and then Champagne itself. Do you guys get over to Champagne a lot? Did you guys move? How did that work?
No, we essentially were always based in Paris. But during Wine and War, one of the best parts of it was that we had bought a place in Normandy. So we were spending a lot of time in Normandy, which of course had its special inspiration for dealing with World War II for us.
Yeah, we were very close to the landing beaches, surrounded by history there too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. How did you guys decide to write books? Was it like something, I know you guys are journalists, you're constantly probably doing research and doing things anyway, but what were you guys like, we just have these memoirs or something that we really just want to compile and share with the world?
After so many years in network news, flying this way, that way, having the phone ring at 2:00 in the morning saying, go to Tehran, we decided it's time to maybe change our lives. And if we're ever going to do it, now is the time. So when another offer from ABC came along saying, we want you to go to the Middle East, we want you to take over the bureau in Israel, I said no. And so we retreated to our home in Normandy. We decided, let's see if we can write a book. What should we write about? We were fascinated with wine. Our vacations were usually taken somewhere in the wine regions. It was just a lovely part of France, and the people there were really fascinating. And we stumbled onto our first book by accident, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In a way, it grew out of Don's work in network news. He had gone to the Loire Valley to cover a story about the construction of France's fast train, the TGV. And when he did that, he met a man by the name of Gaston Huet, who was then the mayor of Vouvray. And we got to know Monsieur Huet quite well, and he invited us to come down. And when we got to his office, he disappeared for a few minutes and came back with a tray that had 3 glasses on it and a dusty, dirty old bottle, and began pouring wine for us and said, now, tell me what you think. And we were overwhelmed with the bouquet. The room just suddenly filled up with the scent of apricots and
honey and everything like that.
And the color was glorious.
Yeah, it was one of his sweet wines. And he said, tell me when you think it was made. And we knew it wasn't made just yesterday, but we started, in the 1990s? And he shook his head, and 1980, how about 75? He continued shaking his head, and each of our guesses was way off. And as we guessed, the smile on his face grew wider and wider. And finally, we got to the 50s, and I gave up. Nope, not 1950. And I said, when did you make this wine? And he said, 1940. He says, it's the finest wine I ever made. And we looked at it, we tasted it again, and we said, this is certainly the best wine we've ever had, but have you ever tasted anything better? And all of a sudden, the smile on his face disappeared, and he became very somber, almost sad. And he said, only once. It was when I was a prisoner of war in Germany. He went on to explain that during his 5 years of captivity, he was able to have one little glass of wine that had been sent in from families who were back in the Loire Valley. And he said it wasn't much of a wine. It was just hardly a drop, nothing special at all. But it was the only wine I had in 5 years. And it was glorious. I'll never forget it. And that's what set us off. We began wondering, how many other stories are there like this? And as we discovered, there were a lot of them.
You can't really separate the history of wine, or I guess contemporary how we understand wine today in France from the World Wars and World War II. Where did you start? Obviously, so much to dive into across such a large country with so many storied wine regions in it. Where did you start with beginning to think about how you could put together a retelling of the war's impact on wine in France?
We started right there, and both Don and I were taken aback by Hewitt saying to us that he was a prisoner of war when he had this wine. And we couldn't begin to imagine how in prison he was able to get the wine. And he began unfolding the story. And we asked him then about, were there other winemakers there? And he said, oh, yeah, there were lots of winemakers in prison during the war. And from that, we began branching out until we found that we could find one family from each of the major regions at that time who could carry us through the war and tell us their experiences to go from the very beginning to the end of the war. And then we had the very good fortune of being invited to a St. Vincent's festival in Champagne, where one of the men there said, oh, you really should talk to Bernard de Nonancourt. He opened up Hitler's Cab. You should talk to him.
Yeah. But it started with Hewitt, and we just began to wonder, how did winemakers and wine producers survive under the German occupation? And so we began knocking on doors, talking to people, and we'd be led from one person to another. And like Petey says, oh, we're told, you should talk to so-and-so. And so the stories began building up. And we ended up with a book that really was a first. It was published in 2001. Yeah, a while ago. But it was a subject that nobody had ever tackled before. The issue of collaboration was still very much alive, still sensitive. There were people right at the start who turned to us and said, forget it, nobody's going to talk to you. One person hung up the phone on us after first agreeing to speak and saying, let the dead rest in peace, let the living live in peace. And that was the reaction of some, but they were very few. Most people were very touched with that we would come to them and want to know, how did you survive during the war? I think they really appreciated it.
I think we were also very lucky at the timing of doing the book. There were still lots of people alive from World War II. By this point, they had done what they wanted to in their lives. They had accomplished a lot. They were ready to sit down and reflect and talk. And many of them had not talked before. I think you find that in a lot of information about World War II and other wars, that it takes a while for people to be comfortable to talk about their experiences and how they survived it. And plus the fact that once the war was over, they were all very eager to get on with their lives. They wanted to put the war behind them. And even though it was an important and impactful event in their lives, they wanted to move on from it and try to do something good in life after all of the horrors of the war.
But like Petey says, we're very lucky to have done the book when we did it, because really nearly all of the principal characters have passed away. It would be impossible to write now. We were very fortunate.
Yeah, I was actually about to mention that maybe, because I was just thinking back at the Normandy commemorations this year, and they're noting the number of veterans, and I was just thinking over that 20-year span, that must have changed a lot. Something I liked about what you guys were saying is, it was in the book in general, it's not only a story of perseverance, but it's also their resilience and kind of their own, I guess, resistance in their own ways. So I hadn't thought about, everybody knows the Nazis tried to they looted art from everywhere. Most people don't think as much about them looting all the wines and actually trying to find the wines. So hiding wine, number one, was its own thing. And then keeping up the vineyards. Everybody talks about how 1945 was an amazing vintage. How did the vines stay healthy and were tended during all those years to make that great vintage? So I think those are two really cool stories. And I've also gone to the Eagle's Nest just because of your guys' book too. Just everybody wants to go up. I'm like, here's where the wine was. We're passing it. So that was also cool. Yeah.
You mentioned how they resisted, and much of the resistance was playing games, hiding their precious stocks behind fake walls. burying their bottles in holes in the ground or under rubbish heaps, wherever they could find it. But it was a dangerous game they were playing, because
if they got caught, they knew that the consequences were not pleasant. And many of them did get caught. We talk about several in our book, or particularly in Champagne, those who did, but many others.
There was Claude Formone, a Champagne executive. He ended up being arrested and thrown into a concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen. And he told us what it was like there, how unbearable the cold was and what he did to survive. He told us that every time I would set a date to live, and when I reached that date, I would set another date and go on that way. And he said, I sang against the cold, I sang against the loneliness, I sang against the brutality that we were experiencing. And
it seemed that songs were the only thing that saved him, he said, but in the end, he said, and he sang children's songs as well. But when he was finally released, he was just a skeleton. And he said, I came home not young anymore. And he was what?
He was 30 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the most heartening things, gratifying things about writing this and coming across stories like that was when Petey was at a luncheon, and I think Formone's uncle or
nephew,
relative,
Formone's
was there.
Nephew was seated next to me, and he said, I asked if I could sit here because I wanted to say thank you to you. Until we read your book, we had no idea what had happened to my uncle. He always refused to talk about it. And for all of us, it was a tremendous loss, because my father and Claude Formone are twins. And until that moment, they had shared everything. There was nothing they didn't talk about together. And after that, Claude never would talk about that with his brother. And for my father, that is, it was very, very painful to finally know what Claude went through was absolutely the greatest gift we could have had, so that we could understand. And for us as well, it was a tremendous gift.
Yeah, so many amazing stories, I'm sure, about the people, and being able to sit there and hear about, honestly, especially for us as Americans, a time that's really hard to fathom what it would be like, seeing your livelihood around you not only being destroyed, looted, decimated, but then also being possibly carried off to another place. I think that takes us here in the U.S. to a place historically where we just have no frame of reference for it. And so it's an amazing story to tell. And not only the people, but also the wines. I'm sure you came across so many stories of maybe vintages that were lost during the war period that are storied and sought after now that we have no record of. And Billy mentioned the stowing away of valuable wines and what sort of lengths that the families went to protect their stock. But what are some of the unique stories or insights that you got in learning about the wines and the vintages and what it was like to produce wine during that period?
It was, of course, incredibly difficult and left to old men, old women, wives, the sisters, the daughters, the children, to do what they could to keep the vines going and to keep them healthy. In some ways, it was a gift, because there was a very natural way of making wine. There was nothing, they had nothing to add. They had no pesticides, no herbicides, any of that sort of thing. They had to deal with it as they could, of course, without gasoline, etc. It meant that there were only animals plowing the vineyards. And one of the most poignant things was listening to May de Lancasang talk about how they use cows to try and plow the vineyards and keep them going. And she said, oh, those poor cows. And they had to give milk, too. It was a poignant moment for that.
But winemaking took on a very natural tone during those days. They simply didn't have the chemicals They didn't have enough copper sulfate to treat mildew. One of our stories involved, however, a fellow who actually did create a little laboratory for himself. He found a scrap iron dealer who smuggled in some material, and he was able to make copper sulfate to treat his wines. But he was almost caught, and that was
Yeah. Scared.
so.
You talked about some wines that have disappeared. The fun of discovering one of the wines that had vanished. We were in Burgundy interviewing d'Angerville, the Marquis d'Angerville, about wine, preparing as we were working on the research for the book. And he said to us, one of the things I really feel bad about was that my father always said that the best wine he ever made was the 1934. And at the end of the war, he sold it all so that we could start the business again. So I never ever tasted this wine that my father was so proud of and that he treasured.
And it's what, a couple of years later?
Yeah, long after the book was done.
Yeah, we're in Champagne, and we happened to pass by an auction house, and we thought, let's go and see if there's anything interesting there to sell or to buy. Maybe we'll come in tomorrow. We went in, and there were cartons just lined up full of this lovely Volnay that d'Angerville was never able to taste.
Wow.
And we thought, let's
We'll
do
be
the
back.
right thing. Let's get on the phone right away and tell him the good news. So we did. We showed up the next day. We decided we got to have some of this wine too. It was all gone. d'Angerville bought it all up. Okay. The good news is that several years later, when we were having a dinner for people who helped us write Wine and War, we thought it'd really be nice to have one of these bottles. So I approached d'Angerville's son and I said, look, I explained the story. He got a big kick out of it. But I said, is there any way I could purchase one of these bottles? And he replied, there's no price that you can put on a bottle of wine like this. Here, take one. It's yours. Enjoy. And it was really good. Really, really good.
Wow. That's an amazing, the stories just continue from the book itself. I also love the idea of not only were they hiding the best wines, but they would also just tell the I guess Nazis, the occupiers, that the wine that they were having was really good, and just assuming that they didn't have a palate, which was also really funny to me as somebody at that time who was just learning wine. I was like, I wouldn't be able to tell if you put a label on it or just tell me it's the best. I'd be like, okay, great. Now I'd leave. But,
well, the Germans, they sent in people called the Weinführers. They were essentially wine merchants in uniform, and their jobs were to put their hands on as much good French wine as possible. And one of these a Weinführer was assigned to each wine region. But this is how I think the people in Berlin made a big mistake, right?
Yeah, because of course, to have people who were going to find the best wine, they had to have people who knew wine and were in the wine business. And of course, the people in the German wine business and importing wines from France knew everybody in the French wine business and had known them for years, for generations. They were good friends. They all spoke each other's languages. Some of them were godfathers to each other's children. They worked in each other's offices. And so when these supposed occupiers came in, they were very clear about the fact that they knew that after the war, they'd still be doing business and that they would still be dealing with each other. So while they made an effort to satisfy what Berlin demanded, they also made an effort to make sure the wine business continued, that the best wines were taken care of. And as one person in Bordeaux, actually several people said, Hans Bommers, the Weinführer of Bordeaux, saved our wine. And he was violently anti-Nazi and particularly anti-Göring. He worked very hard to preserve the wine.
But all of the Weinführers realized that one day the war will end, and we're going to have to do business again with each other. Half of their job was to slake the thirst of their bosses in Berlin, and the other was to protect the interests of the wine growers in France.
In fact, this is something they had learned in World War I, that if you destroy the goose that lays the golden egg, you're going to be in trouble. So Berlin in itself wanted to preserve the French wine industry, hoping it would support the Thousand-Year Reich in the future. And as a result, they did not want to destroy the vineyards or destroy the idea of winemaking. It still had to be preserved at a high quality.
Yeah, it's a picture that is totally different from World War I in Champagne, where nearly everything was destroyed.
Yeah, I was going to say this is a perfect transition. Do you want to discuss your book about Champagne during the First World War, and then we can also talk about your Champagne Charlie book as well after that?
Sure. I think what really came through to us most in Champagne during the First World War was the utter destruction. Everything practically was destroyed. The city of Reims was turned on its head. People had to live underground in the giant crayères where champagne is made and stored. Reims, if you look at pictures today, the destruction is just out of this world. Whole villages outside of the city disappeared, never to be rebuilt. The land was poisoned by so many exploding bombs, chemical bombs that were dropped and fired. And in fact, the funny thing is the war is not over, because they're still finding those shells today, leaking their chemicals into the soil. It might be a farmer driving his tractor through a field where all of a sudden he hits something, or some woman tending her garden and discovering a shell there.
Yeah, there is still a bomb squad that operates in the northern part of France that goes around when they get a call like that they found something has been found, and they collect all of these old unexploded bombs that have been leaking into the ground all these years, and they take them out to, I think it's out in a forest.
A remote forest.
Yeah. And a certain time they will explode several of them. Even a couple of years ago, someone was killed by a World War I bomb. So, as Don said, the war is not over.
When we were researching, one of the people that we dealt with considerably was Christian Paul Roger. And he served us, or he told us about the wartime vintage, 1914, a vintage that had to be harvested when the grapes were still green. Too early, because the Germans were on their way. They had to get the grapes in, and that was that. And everybody predicted that the wine, the champagne, would never come around. It would be undrinkable. During one of our interviews, Paul Roger went and got several bottles of 1914 and poured it for us. Lucky us. What a revelation.
Yeah, it was obviously old, but it still had bubbles. Just a few, you could count them as they came up in the glass. And there was still a freshness to it that, at that time, we're talking about a wine that was nearly a century old. And it was still drinkable, and it's still pleasurable. So,
but because the grapes were so green and so acidic, that's why it was so long-lived. That's why it was drinkable now, but maybe not way back then.
Yeah, and you spend a lot of time in both of your books, I assume, in terms of how you put them together and contemplating sort of Champagne's meteoric rise, especially in the States, and how champagne came to be not just a beverage, but an elevated celebratory drink that you would share with people, that would be a special occasion wine, and sort of that rise historically. Can you just tell us about what you learned about marketing in champagne and how it came to have that allure to it?
Marketing in Champagne seems to be in their blood. I don't think anybody in Champagne is born without knowing how to sell something. It is, I hope that somebody studying the history of marketing will tell us why this area has become so spectacularly successful with it. But it has, from the time when we're talking about Champagne Charlie, they seem to have an innate sense of how to sell, a very personal and yet a very elegant way of handling things.
One of the great ironies is how Champagne, a region that's been drenched with so much blood, should give rise to a beverage that is a symbol of friendship, good times, celebration. But, that's something that I think a lot of people miss when they're drinking champagne. Champagne has probably seen more bloodshed, more suffering than any other place in the world. You start with Attila the Hun. His most famous battle was fought there. You have the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Wars of Spanish Succession, a series of religious wars.
French Revolution.
A terrible civil war called the Fronde.
Yeah.
And, a couple of world wars. And before all that, let's not forget the Romans. They came trooping in too. But I lost my train of thought.
I'll tell you, I think you're going to talk about the wild tribes coming from the east.
Yeah, before all that happened, wild tribes from the east descended.
Yeah.
One historian said that Champagne has suffered from an overdose of invasions.
So
but it's made it tough, and it's given the people who make champagne today, I think, a kind of resilience. It's not spoken about, but it's there, and you can sometimes feel it and taste it.
Yeah, and to go there today, nobody thinks about how just 80 years ago it was under fire all the time. I think nobody today thinks about this bloody history of this tiny corner of France. But it remains somehow, as Don said, ingrained in that it makes a certain resilience of the people who just keep going. The crayères where the champagne is made and aged, these are Roman creations. The history is there, and it's part of why the champagne continues to be made. I think they feel that.
Yeah.
Out of all the characters, I guess it's interesting that Charles Heidsieck was in a period of peacetime in Champagne, ended up in a war in the United States. But how did you pick him as a character that you guys really wanted to focus on? There is definitely a milieu, a lot of characters in Champagne in that era.
I think in our second book, we touched our second book dealing with Champagne. We touched, I think, for one long paragraph about Champagne Charlie, the man who introduced champagne to the United States. And somebody came up to us and said, isn't there more to the story? You've just written one paragraph. And we thought, yeah, we think there's more to it. And so we began looking around and we discovered, we think there's enough for a book here. And so we went to it, and it turned out to be a pretty good yarn. It's funny, though, huh? We start with Wine and War, World War II, and then we go back in time, World War I, and then back to 1850 when Heidsieck went off to America.
And
everybody's saying, to the Civil War.
So we're thinking maybe next, the Peloponnesian Wars?
Who knows? Who knows? But Heidsieck, he made his mark by doing something that everybody said was crazy. You'll go broke. America is a slovenly country. It's crude, it's unsophisticated, and it's filled with wild Indians. And Heidsieck said, heck with it. I'm going there anyway. That's where I'm going to make my fortune, make a name for myself. He probably would have stayed in Europe, except the markets there were saturated. And off he went, and he was very successful. If he hadn't been caught up in the Civil War and
imprisoned,
accused of being a spy for the South.
Do you think he was inspired? I can't remember. I read the book, but it's been a little while. Was he inspired by like some of the kind of the Veuve Clicquot and their efforts? Like, I'm trying to find a better word, but basically their audacious efforts to circumvent some of the blockades at the end of the Napoleonic War and get to Russia first. Do you think he saw the United States as a new market like Russia was?
He was inspired by his father.
Yeah, who did go to Russia. Yeah. His father was a figure almost of legend who during the Napoleonic Wars decided he would beat Napoleon to Moscow and set up shop and be ready to sell champagne to no matter who won. And so he just needed to do it dramatically, he felt. So he bought this enormous white stallion, had big basket side saddlebags for it, stuffed with champagne. And he took, I guess, a servant and another, and rode from France the 2,000 kilometers to Moscow. And he did beat Napoleon, and he was more successful than Napoleon as well, and sold a lot of champagne and got orders.
It was a big hit with the Tsar and the Tsarina. He couldn't have done better. But it was Heidsieck's father that really, I think, inspired him and do him one better.
And as you said, the people like Veuve Clicquot, like Louise Pommery, these were very audacious people. Even though he had this wild idea and people discouraged him, it probably wasn't all that odd for a champenois to say, oh, let's do something crazy. Let's do something dramatic. And so he did.
Yeah, now it's coming back to me. I was mixing up the beginning of the two books there. And then can you talk a little bit about, people should read the book and find out more detail, but the kind of the infighting and the conflict with the Heidsieck family itself? Because now whenever I'm in the store, I'm always like, Dan the Piper Heidsieck, like I'm all about the Charles Heidsieck wines. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, Petey's better at family trees than I am, but Charles had a big fight with
the Heidsieck family. There was the patriarch, shall we say, was a man named Franz Joseph Heidsieck, who came from Germany to France, and he was selling wool, I think, or buying wool, and he fell in love with the wool maker's daughter and stayed. And they always had a little bit of champagne making on the side. They used it to give to customers to sweeten the deal. And he decided he would expand the champagne making thing, that was where the future was. He had, however, no children. So he brought in 3 nephews to help him out. And one of them was Charles Heidsieck, and then there were 2 others. And things all went well, but when Franz Joseph died, of course, there was a lot of infighting. Who gets what? And eventually, they all separated, and that's why we have 3 Heidsieck firms today. But it was a particularly bitter battle for Charles Heidsieck, the senior, the father of the Charles Heidsieck we write about, who felt he was pushed out when he was, in fact, the one who had been developing all of the marketing, etc., of the company. So he was particularly motivated to ride Moscow.
Yeah. Anyway, Charles decided, okay, if I can't make it in this house, if they're going to promote somebody over my head, I'm going to go off and found my own champagne house. And that's what he did. That's how the house of Charles Heidsieck came into being.
When you reflect on the research that you did across the different in Champagne, all around France, both of the wars, do you think about, and did you see things continue to come up that the wine industry in France are still dealing with today? Think of things like regulations and trade laws, or climate changes in climate. Yeah. Do you see carryover between some of the challenges that the winemakers were dealing with then, apart from war and destruction, as you see today?
There certainly, the regulations continue to be something that they struggle with. The regulations are both the very best thing and the very worst thing, I think, for them. Because of the regulations, every inch of soil in Champagne is recorded. They know exactly what it is, what it can produce, etc. And the very stringent regulations keep Champagne a very high quality product. But they also restrict, and it has meant a lot of conflict, particularly, I think, among the younger champagne makers. Some of the they've developed more independent marks recently.
Yeah. They're now growing their own grapes, making their own champagne, not selling them to the big houses. And I think it's an exciting venue. A lot of new styles are being introduced. Brut, extra brut. It's fun to experiment and try some of these. This is not to denigrate the product of the major houses. They're wonderful, but it's an adventure to try something new and different.
Yeah.
But speaking of the restrictions and the laws that are laid down about how much can be produced, et cetera, a few years ago, the authorities decided, all right, we're going to enlarge the growing area of Champagne. And one of our people that we got to know, Claude Taittinger, said, I'm against it. We've got to preserve the quality of what we have here. And if you just expand the growing area and let people grow grapes wherever they want, it's going to be our ruin. And I said, yeah, they're pretty strong. They have a lot of muscle. And he said, it's not going to happen. And if it does, it'll be over my dead body. Claude is no longer alive and the growing area got bigger. So that's life.
Yeah.
That's do you, in your own wine drinking and exploration today, do you have a cellar there at your house? Do you still travel often? And what's your wine consumption like?
Our wine consumption, I guess at the moment, has gone down. We've had a lot of work to do at the house, but our wine cellar has also gone down, which I suppose is that the good news? We had way too many bottles.
More than we would ever drink, even if we lived to be 100. So we sold off a lot of it. It helped pay the bills, and it helped us buy a house in the country where we are now at. We still have a number of precious bottles that we've never found the right moment for drinking. One of them is a 1937 Domaine de la Romanée Conti, a wine that is reputed to be out of this world. Another wine comes from
The Café Voisin
Café Voisin, the famous cafe that
staged a New Year's dinner during the siege of Paris, where they served
in 1870, the 1870 Franco-Prussian War,
where they served elephant consommé,
bear chops,
kangaroos,
flambéed cat by rats.
Oh no!
This was because the city was starving. They had moved they had sacrificed all of the animals in the zoo and made do as best they could.
But the cellar at Café Voisin was extremely well stocked, and they had lots of good wine to wash down the bear chops. And was it at an auction where we ran across the bottle of Café Voisin wine?
Yeah. So to have a bottle of wine like that and search desperately for the right moment to try it has been quite impossible. I mean, I just can't bring myself to open it. But we are fascinated by older wines, history in a bottle, that kind of thing. We find that as we get older, we're enjoying younger wines with a little more fruit to them. But no, the fascination with something old and precious that is no longer available, it's still with us.
Awesome. I think that's a perfect place to end it here. That's just same with me. I'm more interested in the stories behind a lot of bottles than sometimes the liquid in the bottle itself. This has been so great. Thank you so much for sharing your time. We've loved having you on.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right. That was our interview with Don and Petie Kladstrup. I hope everybody learned a bunch of interesting stories and historical perspective. I certainly did. I love the interview. But if you are attempting to drink some very old wines and maybe you don't want to pull the cork, you can use your Corbin. Corbin will allow you to taste these wines over a period of time and allow you to drink them without having to pull the cork out, which might crumble. So if you don't have an Osso and you have a Corbin, you're good to go with getting your wine out of any bottle, whether it be a young bottle or an old one. That is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.